Okay, this is welcome from Extramural Studies. I'm Fanula Dowling. This is a very small group, and it's got nothing to do with the lack of popularity of this subject. But we decided, because of the protests on campus, not to send out a reminder notice because we weren't sure who would read it and how they would react. But we still wanted to go ahead with the lecture. So it's a small but sincere audience. And I think, I'm fascinated by my own family tree, and I'm sure many of you are too. And so it's wonderful to have June McKinnon here with us, who definitely the bug has bitten her, and she's been telling me about all the research she's done. She's a qualified historian and has written 2 books on her research into Cape families. Her speciality is scandal. The scandal that we find.
And females.
And females, of course. But you've also written a lot of articles for all the sort of historical society journals and the genealogical society journals. And then these 2 books. The one is A Tapestry of Lives, Women of the Cape in the 17th Century, and a very recent one, Wine, Woman and Good Hope, A History of Scandalous Behaviour in the Cape. So, June, a very warm welcome to you.
Right. Right, good evening, everybody. Am I preaching to the converted? Who of you have done your family tree? You. Okay, good. What do I press? Oh, this. There we go. Right. South Africa has got some of the richest archival history for genealogists. When I did my research for my book, A Tapestry of Lives, Cape Women of the 17th Century, I wondered who the descendants of these women were. And most of them were very feisty women, and they turned out to be my ancestors. Because you don't only do your male family tree, you take all the women as well and marry in. On my mother's side, the Engelbrechts, I've got 350 names. I'm related to just about everybody in South Africa. Those of you who are about to set out on this journey, I must warn you, it gets hold of you. You can't get rid of it. You've got to have time, you've got to have passion and perseverance. And don't be afraid to ask other genealogists for help. No question is too stupid, ever. And the staff at the Cape Archives are very helpful, as are those in the South African Library. Some of the best, to start off, your best research article is Lombard and Heerser. They're the editors, South African genealogies. You'll find them in the big yellow books. They're on your reference shelf of your libraries, most of the big libraries. I know Plumstead Library hasn't got them, very tiny, but most of the big libraries have got them. And take your parents' names, your aunts and uncles, grandparents, siblings, whatever you know, and have a look through those books. Because quite often, you look at a tree, like I looked at the Engelbrechts, and there were 2 trees when I first started. The first one was very short, and the second one was longer, and I could see immediately, because my granny had 9 children who survived, and I could see by the names who was my tree. So this is where it helps to know aunts and uncles' names and siblings of your grandparents if you possibly can. And also, if you've got Dutch and German ancestry, quite often the English also do this. The first son is named after the paternal grandfather, the second son after the maternal grandfather. The first daughter is named after the maternal grandmother, and the second daughter of the paternal grandmother. And once you're armed with this, Lombard and Heerser also make mistakes, and quite often your family only goes as far as 1845 or something like that. Then take what you've got or what you haven't got and go to the Cape Archives in Roland Street. They're open from, I think it's 9:30 to 4 o'clock every afternoon except a Thursday. I only go on a Thursday because they close at 7. And to get out of there, the traffic is murder. So I walk out of there when it's cold and raining at 6:45. And they're very helpful. And they look for the death notices. They're normally MOOC, death notices and estates. And there you'll find clues as to who your great-great-grandfather was and who their children were, what farm they lived in, what street they lived in, and quite often what they died of, which can help you if you've got an hereditary disease in the family as well. To search for material in the archives in the Eastern Cape, Free State, Natal and Gauteng, log in on your computer into the National Automated Archival Information Retrieval System, or NARS. It's a database, and this will give you only the name that you type in, say it's John Collins, and perhaps the date of a death notice, but no further information. Then you will have to contact through them a professional genealogist who will do the research for you. They don't often charge very much, and most of them, if they can't come up with anything and they hit a blank wall, they won't charge you at all. Then also the Genealogical Institute of South Africa, which is part of the University of Stellenbosch, that holds the Dutch Reformed Church records. So, but there you have to phone for an appointment, and a fee is payable per hour. Let me go down one. Yeah. Sorry, I was going up again. Right. Pay a visit to the Genealogical Society of the Western Cape. They're also of the Western Cape, and they're in Pinelands. They meet at Sasnev, which is a Suid-Afrikaanse Nederlandse vereniging, on the Saturday, second Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And visitors are welcome. It's 10 rand, and you get some nice eats afterwards, refreshments, and you can ask. Our chairman always says, stand up, who's here, who's a visitor, what are you researching? And then, afterwards people will come up to you and say, oh, I'm researching Collins or Engelbrecht, and talk to you. They also have a fantastic website, because they are part of the Genealogical Society of South Africa, which is a wonderful website. They are based in Pretoria, Johannesburg, and there you can find graveyards, and you can actually see the gravestones and read the epitaphs on some of those gravestones, which often clears up a mystery or a brick wall that you've been hitting. For information, for looking at most of you, you probably have British relatives. I found one of the best sites was on the internet was Scotland's Family. Don't use Scotland's people, you have to pay. Don't pay for sites. Scotland's Family is free, and from that you can find not only Scottish family, you can find Welsh and English, very seldom Irish. Irish is a big problem, because the Irish only started registering births in 1845. My great-grandfather was born in 1842, so he wasn't registered, and marriages in 1848. But they do have a census that came out in 1850. So if you go into, Google in Irish genealogy, census, and see what you come up with, and that's very good. It's like the Scottish one is wonderful. They give you the streets that people lived in, they give you their occupations, how many children they had, even the servants or the cook or whoever's living in the house is really good. Also, you can Google in, if you're really stuck, South African genealogy, and then just type in a surname, like van der Westhuizen afterwards. And you'll come up with various sites, like pages of it, and you choose something, and you often find that some other van der Westhuizen has done a lot of work for you. And you go through his family tree, which you'll find on that site, and they will sort out mysteries for you. It's a very good thing to try. Also, to put the flesh, once you've got these people, you've just got the names and the bare bones, and if you're lucky, where they've stayed, what their occupation was. You want to put flesh on the skeletons. Then you visit the South African Library in the Gardens. And there it's free, laptops are allowed, and pens. Oh, I must tell you, the archives, you're not allowed to take a pen, only pencils, and you may take a laptop. Search in books and newspapers, on the reading room shelves of the South African Library, in the reading room. It's against the wall there. They've got the Cape Almanacs and the Juters, and they start from about 1834, and they give you the streets of Cape Town as they multiplied, and they give you the people, the names of the people who lived in those houses and in the streets, and they give you the businesses and who lived in them. And when they get up to about time of the Boer War, 1900, they don't go much further, about 1905, I think. Then you actually they go further up into the Northwestern Cape, where they give you the names of farms and who was farming there. That it's a very interesting books to look at. I've done the Genealogical Society. Another Family History Society, they meet at the St. John's Church Hall in Wynberg on the third Saturday of every month at 2 p.m. And they've also got a website. And they specialize largely on English and British ancestry, whereas our genealogical, we do everything, whatever. We had 2 years ago, every month we had a speaker with Portuguese, Italian, Jewish, whatever ancestry, because we do everything. Right. Let's go on. Our ancestors who arrived in the first 150 years were from the back streets of the cities of Europe and the small poor holdings. Karel Skuman, he's wonderful. He used to run the manuscript room in the South African Library. He's a fantastic author. And he says, don't look in the mirrored halls of Versailles and the palaces of Europe for your ancestors. They aren't there at all. The 30 Years' War in Northern Europe caused inflation, unemployment. And men were desperate, absolutely desperate for jobs. Widows and orphans, there was corruption, and men flocked to the VOC for employment. Nothing changes. The richest, which was the richest and biggest commercial company in the world, most of them were employed as soldiers or sailors. They were the lowest paid and the most badly treated in the company, no matter what their original occupation was. My maternal ancestor, Jan Engelbrecht, arrived as a soldier, but he was a cooper by trade. After 3 years for a sailor and 5 years service for a soldier at the Cape, you could become a free burgher and you were granted land, which they could never afford if they were back in Europe. Jan was one of the first trekkboers to buy land in the Northwestern Cape. My book, Wine, Women, and Good Hope, A History of the Scandalous Behaviour at the Cape, was inspired by drawing up family trees for relations and friends who were absolutely aghast at the hijinks of their ancestors. The skeletons just fell out of the cupboard, drunk, adulterous, conmen, wild and faster women, you name it. Most South African families have Indian or what they used to call Malay slave blood. They weren't Malays. They were mostly from the Bay of Bengal. And Khoi blood in their family trees, which shocked even those who were professing not to be racist. Only a few have Khoisan speakers as ancestors. The Haines family is one of them. Willem van der Merwe was a soldier and an officer. And to be an officer, he had to be tall and strong. He was well over 6 foot to carry a big rifle. The VOC loaned the soldiers out to work for farmers because there was a terrible labor shortage. Willem worked at Groote Kerk, which was the VOC's barn, where he impregnated his slave lover, Cloete of Guinea. She started labor, and he ran to fetch a tot of brandy to ease Cloete's pain. The foreman took pity on him and gave him a tot as well. His daughter was born, they called her Merwe, and she became one of Simon van der Star's most trusted house slaves. In his will, Simon manumitted her, and she married Michiel Haines, and is the matriarch of the South African Haines family. Willem then became a free burgher, and he bought the farm Valkenburg. He married Elsie, who was the daughter of his next-door neighbor, Jacob Cloete. They had umpteen children, one of whom is my ancestor. After their wives died, Willem and Jacob Cloete were warned to stop their sinful behavior of sleeping with their slave women and female Khoikhoi servants. My ancestor, Tillman Hendricks, worked at Koenhoop, as a foreman, which was Van Riebeck's storage barn. After Van Riebeck left, he bought part of the land. This building has been restored, and it can be seen where Settlers Way intersects the Leesbeek Parkway. It's on your right-hand side, but the original building was somewhere under the bridge. Van Riebeck had a lot to answer for. He planted vines for wine and barley to make beer for all the passing trade of ships, and of course the locals got in on the act. Tillman started selling arak, which was cheap, highly intoxicating wine, was made from rice, and also local brandy, but competition was stiff. Jacob van Roosendaal, he was one of the head gardeners, also one of my ancestors, he had bought Van Riebeck's farm Boschhevel, and he produced wine, so he sold wine from his vineyard. His wife, Katrine, was offering the first cup free. Tillman's wife, Macon, spread the word that that was not all that Katrine was offering, because she said that Katrine was a prostitute in Holland, a gutter snipe, whose father was in the workhouse. Katrine took Macon to the Council of Justice, where she was fined for slander. Tillman was the first case of drunk driving at the Cape. His next-door neighbour was ex-German soldier and my ancestor, Hans Russ, whose farm stretched from the Leesbeek over the Rondebosch Common up the fountain, if only I had a bit of that. In 1662, Hans married Katharina Ustings, who arrived as a widow after her German mercenary husband died on board the ship. The wedding was in the little church which was attached to the fort. There wasn't a castle yet, it was a wooden mud fort. After a riotous reception, the guests in their cups climbed into the wagons for the journey back to their farms. Tillman, as drunk as a skunk, raced his wagon along the narrow path and upended Hans's wagon. Hans sprang out, yelled at Tillman to stop swearing in front of his bride. Macon grabbed Hans by his long hair, pulled him backwards, and Tillman stabbed him with a knife. Sorry, I've lost. There you go. The hilt of the knife broke off in Hans's ribs, and Hans was rushed hemorrhaging to the VOC hospital, which at the time was opposite the slave lodge and which eventually became the colonial orphan chamber at the top of Adley Street, where my ancestor, Danish surgeon Pieter van Meerhoff, removed the blade. Hans spent 2 months in hospital. Pieter van Meerhoff was born in the shadow of Shakespeare Hamlet's castle Elsinore, where his father was a soldier. When he came to the Cape, he married Cloete, or Eva, who was Van Riebeck's Khoikhoi children's nanny and interpreter. Their daughter, Petronilla, married Daniel Simon, plantation owner on Mauritius. And there are thousands of descendants because when the French took it over from the Dutch, they came to live in Stellenbosch. And their descendants include author Daniel Mathieu, historian Dan Slee, half my genealogy society, myself, F.W. de Klerk, Jannie Smuts, and Paul Kruger. I hope they're all turning in the graves. And Hans Shame, poor thing, was mauled by a lion on his farm while he was mending the fence near the fountain, and he died of septicemia. Katerina sprang on a horse astride and bareback and shot the lion. Katerina's husband, number 3, was killed by the Khoikhoi for illegally hunting game in their territory, which was at Macassar Beach. Number 4 was trampled to death by an elephant while bounty hunting hippos for the VOC. And then with 5 children under the age of 12, she was 36 years old, she applied for a widow's rice ration. And here comes the juicy part. The new governor was Simon van der Stel, who hated his wife, left her in Holland, brought his kids here. And he chose only married women as mistresses because he enriched their husbands. They never said anything. Katerina had been widowed 4 times, so that was good enough. He granted her land under the Steenberg Mountains, which she called Swaneveder. Van der Stel's farm, Groote Kerk at the time, stretched all the way there. Part of the deal was that Katrin had to care for a herd of Simon's cattle grazing next door. She must have done more than care for his cattle, because when Commissioner from the VOC van Rede tot Drakenstein on a tour here complained to Simon van der Stel that he was a useless governor, the farmers were so poor, he said, listen, I'm going to take you to the 4 best farms. The last one was Katarina's farm. Van Rede tot Drakenstein raved about it. He said it was the best managed farm. The widow, trained Russ, as he called her, after 2 years, this poor widow had orchards, fields of grain, livestock of every kind, and one of the most telling things to see if your ancestor was well off are the number of slaves that they owned. Male slaves were far more expensive than females, although it should have been the other way around, because if you had a female slave and she had children, you never bought slaves again, because those children were your slaves forever, and you passed them on to your kids. And Train owned 6 male slaves and 1 female. And for this, you can also go onto the internet. You will find it sometimes in the old death notices, but a good site on your internet is Orphan Chamber Records for wills and estates, and they detail just about every bit of crockery those people left, every little container where they put their perfume or their powder and their clothes, and how many slaves they had, their farm, the farm instruments, everything is there. Katarina's farm is now Steenberg Estate. And those days, women didn't get granted title deeds, but she kept on at Van der Stel and eventually granted her one. So what more could one say? She was a good mistress. And it's actually in a plaque on a sort of the old brick wall, a little plaque there, granted to the widow trained Russ. I have 2 lines of descent from her, from my maternal Engelbrecht line. Her husband, number 5, was a toy boy. He was 25 years old and a foreman, and she was 40. And 2 years later, she sold Swanevelde and she bought the farm Justenburg. And if you go along the N1 towards Stellenbosch, the farm Justenburg is on your right-hand side with pylons and the winery. It's not open to the public, but, sorry, that's on the left. On the right is a road going, it's a big sign to a lovely delicatessen, a delicious farm with food and wine tasting, and they've got a bit of the history of Justenburg as well, where they do the wine tasting. Another warning if you're doing genealogical research, don't believe all the sources while you're researching. This is why I say check Lombard and Hesse, check the South African Library, check the archives, everywhere you go. Francois Le Vaillant, a Frenchman, was feted by society at the Cape. He had rich sponsors in France, and he lived in the lap of luxury at Cape. His wife and children in Paris were starving. He never sent them anything. He boasted that the daughters of the Trekboers, Cornelius van der Westhuizen and Hermanus Engelbrecht, both of them were my ancestors. That's Hermanus' farm, which was the last farm between the Kamiesberg and the Charib River, which was the Orange River at the time. And nearly all the travelers and adventurers stayed at his farm, and they wrote beautiful, this was South African Library is wonderful. And go and look at all the books that they wrote about these people. Le Vaillant boasted that the daughters of the Trekboers, Cornelius van Westhuizen and Engelbrecht, tried to seduce him, but he didn't fancy country bumpkins. But when far more reliable sources, Colonel Robert Gordon, who was in charge of the castle when the English arrived, and James Patterson, stayed with the Van der Westhuizens and the Engelbrechts, their wives told their Gordon and Patterson that they'd sjambocked Le Vaillant out of their houses for trying to seduce their teenage daughters who rejected his advances, and warned them that if they tried the same, the sjambok was ready. Le Vaillant also labelled Claudina van der Westhuizen a liar when she told him that she was of French ancestry, because her French had such a heavy Dutch accent. Her mother was Jean Guillemet, a French Huguenot born in Berlin, whose father was invited by the VOC to start the silk industry at the Cape. Spin Street behind Parliament is where the factory was, full of silkworms. And the brandy farm in Stellenbosch still has some of the original mulberry trees that he planted. Gordon and Patterson stayed on the farm of Jean, whose first husband was Jan Engelbrecht, Claudina and Amanus's father. Both explorers described her as the old French woman who still spoke French fluently. And this is where you also sometimes have stumbling blocks when you're doing research. Names are sometimes misleading because either the person who was writing it in didn't understand what you were saying because you were speaking French and he was Dutch or German, vice versa, or he just decided he was going to make it into a Dutch name. They changed Guillemets, became Guillemets, and Jean became Johanna. My French Huguenot ancestor, David Saint-Charles, became David Senekal. And your great-great-grandfather, you knew him as Johannes Jacobus Willem van der Merwe, but his death notice says he's Willie or Jaco. And you're thinking, who is this bloke? But that is what the family called him to distinguish from the other 6 cousins who were also named Johannes Jacobus Willem van der Merwe. Right. And while you're researching, wonderful historian Phyllis de Broek-Simon, she said to me, June, sometimes you can sit a whole day at the archives or the South African Library and you can find, if you're lucky, one thing, sometimes nothing. But on the way you find interesting things. So write them down, you'll always use it. And while researching, I went through Lady Anne Barnard's diaries. She was a great scandal monger and remarked that the babies of the Dutch women all came too early. Dutchmen told it was the marriages that came too late. Her diaries are full of gossip about local families and the elite British circle at the Cape. But she had a chip on her shoulder. She was in her 30s when she married Andrew, and of course she was the daughter of a Scottish earl and very wealthy, and she had the title. Andrew was 12 years younger than her, a wastrel. His father disowned him. Lady Anne secured him the post of secretary to the governor at the Cape. Andrew had fathered 2 sons with a courtesan in England. And somebody at the Family History Society, I suppose you people all know, said to me, what's the difference between a courtesan and a prostitute? Well, prostitute is, I come from behind the Boerewors curtain, the ones that stand with the mini skirts when it's 4 degrees and it's raining in Voortrekker Road at night. And a courtesan is for the rich and, the princes and the nobles and the wealthy. He'd had 2 children by her. 6-year-old Harvey accompanied the Barnards to the Cape, but he was so badly behaved that they put him on the next ship headed back for England. Lady Anne went back to England when the Dutch were scheduled to take over the Cape again. Andrew stayed on. He died from a fever at the Cape and left her all his belongings, as well as a small daughter he'd fathered at the Cape. To her credit, Lady Anne sent for the child, educated her, made her her personal companion, and tried to introduce her into elite society, where she failed, because a girl of colour was not acceptable in those circles. And now my arch enemy, because I'm a feminist. Cecil Rhodes was arch anti-feminist, and he met his match in Princess Radziwill, who professed to be married to Prince Radziwill, who fathered her 3 daughters. In London, she forged papers of introduction to Rhodes, stating she was a journalist separated from her princely husband. She booked a berth on the ship which Rhodes sailed back to the Cape on. She attempted to faint into his arms, but he sidestepped. Cape society was fascinated by the supposedly real princess. And Rhodes eventually had to post a watch at his front gate, and he had a horse saddled at the back gate, and whenever she approached, he jumped on the horse, rode hell for leather off in the opposite direction. She stole papers from his office, which are presumed to have been able to incriminate him in planning the Jameson raid, to blackmail him. After he died, she claimed support for a baby daughter he'd fathered with her. The child proved to be non-existent. His executors prosecuted her for forging his signature on promissory notes and other documents, and they agreed that she was no princess but a courtesan living with Prince Radziwill. She landed up in prison at the Cape, and after release about 2 years later, hightailed it with her 3 supposedly Radziwill daughters to America. In the case of Princess Radziwill, I was lucky to consult a live source. One of the problems with genealogy is that most people are not interested in searching for dead family, most young people aren't interested in searching for dead family members. And by the time we start digging down the roots of that tree, our grandparents and our parents are no longer there to fill in vital information. The Radziwill family is a vast noble family with Polish and Russian branches. I wrote to my uncle, Valery Pikel, then aged 85, he's now 90, living in Sydney, in Australia. His father was the Russian Prince Radziwill, who fled during the Russian Revolution to Japan, China, and then to South America, and gave up his title. Uncle Val sent me his family tree. It is stunning. It's this thick, and it's all done in calligraphy with all the crests and the names of the princes and the princesses and the history of Russia and Poland, dating back to 1300 of the Polish and the Russian Radziwills. He told me there's no record of his father's Polish cousin marrying the supposed princess who arrived at the Cape. He agreed that she was a courtesan and living by her wits. Uncle Val was an engineer based in Singapore, and he was on a British boat, and he was put ashore in Cape Town because he had yellow jaundice. When he recovered, he met my aunt, pretty blonde Hebrecht Jacoba Maria Engelbrecht, and married her. So there's royal blood flowing through my cousins in Australia's veins, but not in mine. And this is also a warning to many aspirant genealogists. You always find people who claim they've got royal descent. It's mostly a myth. Our Cape ancestors were salt of the earth, soldiers, sailors. Some of them eventually made their way up in the world. My sister-in-law insisted that her father was a McKinnon, was nobility, and born in a castle in Scotland. My daughter visited the castle and said they must have been burgies if they gave birth. They gave birth to him there. Half the castle is still ruined and overgrown with weeds since Henry VIII destroyed it, and the restoration only began after World War II, and half of it is a museum, the rest in ruins. My husband was a Freemason. He wrote the Freemason Lodge in Peterhead, so you must follow up any little bit that you've got, because John suddenly thought, oh, let's try the Freemasons in Peterhead. And they were wonderful. They sent us photographs of the graveyard in Peterhead with the McKinnon plot with about 4 or 5 generations of McKinnons buried there. They were a mine of information, but there's no nobility at all. My brother-in-law, Peter Douglas's mother, was a member of the Fairbridge family. The family was squeaky clean, so I could find no scandal. But one of the employers did the trick. Historian Philida Brooke Simon's grandmother was Ethelreda Fairbridge. She married Henry Curry, who was Cecil Rhodes' secretary. They got engaged secretly because Rhodes told his staff they were not allowed to marry. When Rhodes found out about the engagement, he ranted on about having to lose Harry to Ethelreda and threatened to fire him. He bided his time, and when the couple reluctantly invited him to their wedding in 1892 at the reception, he loomed over Ethelreda and declared in a stage whisper, "I'm very jealous of you, you know." His wedding present was to uproot them to Johannesburg. There, Harry found Rhodes's younger brother Ernest in charge of the goldfields instead of himself. Ernest was totally incompetent, and all the disasters, and he made many, he blamed on Harry, who hurried back to Cape Town, stormed into Rhodes's office, and demanded to be reinstated. Rhodes sat reading the newspaper, which he kept in front of his face, never once looked at Harry, made no comment. Harry resigned and sued Rhodes. The Prime Minister then decided to pay back the money out of court. Nothing's changed. I hope you all have as much fun as I've had in pulling piles of skeletons out of your ancestral closets. Any questions? No?
Princess Radziwill, I live in Port Bay, and she was tried in the, everybody drives past, everybody sat in the stop-go right next to what used to be the courthouse.
Yes,
Port Bay,
yes.
not realizing that it's on the corner of Clairvaux when you go up to Boys Drive. So she must have been tried there because he must have been resident in Muizenberg.
Yes, she lived out in the southern suburbs way because he was at the cottage at the time because he died in his cottage, Rhodes cottage. Anybody else? No?
Yeah,
I'm very deaf. I'm 76.
I'll try and share. When I was doing some research for my honors thesis on it focused on some slave women.
Come closer, come closer.
Okay. Stand maybe.
Stand next to June. She's got a mic.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a mic. Then they can hear what you're saying as well. Come here. You speak in the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but then you speak in the while saying they can hear what you're saying as well.
Oh, okay.
So they come here, then they can hear your question.
Okay. I was just wondering.
Closer.
Okay. I was just wondering, how does one, if you're doing genealogical research, say on not a white family,
Yeah.
because you often find the genealogical records only trace. I mean, I know those sources because I did research in the Cape Archives.
Mm.
You have to look for, if you're looking for, say, somebody was a slave, etc., then you have to look through the records of the master surname.
Yes.
And then also, so I was wondering, how does one then begin to do genealogical research using these resources, which is organized under the records of mostly white people? So how would one begin then, for example, if you want to do genealogical research on your family? If you don't know, I was just wondering, how does one go about what, do you go the same route and then try and trace the origins through the possible intermarriage?
Yeah. In Lombard and Hesse, they have got certain sections, especially the very big families, where they will put their, the Engelbrecht family, the oldest brother. He was disowned by the family, and he married a Khoi woman, and they've got whole strips of Khoi descent of Khoi family there, and some of the others have got that as well. And it was about 6 years ago, Lombard and Hesse, I think you could phone Stellenbosch University, the Genealogical Institute, and ask them what has happened, or UWC, I think it was from UWC. They were going to do research into what you're looking for, people of coloured families, of colour, slave blood and Khoi and whatever.
So those who came from, as you say, from outside of South Africa, for example.
Yeah, well, that's any help I can give you. And then if you look at, have you ever looked at Grense? It was banned at one stage, but it's in most public libraries on the reference shop, Grense, and I think it's by Hesse, and it's also at the archives.
Oh, okay.
And that gives you like a lot of intermarriage and that. But when you start going through all these families, you always, in every South African family, I was just telling Fanilo before we started, my friend Mike Word, he's Catholic, but he decided when his son was 13, he wanted to have a big thing, his grandson, like the Jewish people have, a big thing. And he said, June, you've got to do the family tree. And he looked at me and he said, you won't find any Khoi like you've got, or Indian slave blood. In mine's all Scottish and British, English. And when I started to look, there was no British, no Scottish, they're all Irish. And of course, you take the women who marry in. And two of the first women who married into the Wood family tree in about 18 Footsack, their surnames were Bird and Birch. And they were from Ireland, and their fathers had married Maria van die Kaap and Sarah van die Kaap. And when you got van die Kaap, that means it's either slave blood or, no, not normally Khoi, but, and you find in every family. And so this is what tickled me to write this book, because people were,
We've got somebody in the audience, Matthew Nissen, whose family comes from the Phenomenal Missions there.
oh yes, yes.
Have records.
I can't hear, I'm very deaf. Can you? Yes, I went to Genadendal when, before I started my master's degree, because I was doing it through UNISA, and I was having a fight with the head of the history department, and I said I wanted to start a feminism, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Not that I'm like rabid Christian, but it was feminist. And he said to me, oh, go down to UWC because they're having a whole symposium for 4 days with historians, and you'll find somebody who will get you out of that stupid idea. And the first, I'm digressing, the very first lecture was a Canadian professor, stood up there and he said, why has nobody written than the Women's Christian Temperance Union who got the vote for women? So I couldn't wait to speak to him afterwards. And then, can't think of his name, he wrote the book on Genadendal. He wrote 2 books on the missionaries there. And he was there and he took us over the weekend. We went there for the day and we sat in the church and we went to the little museum. It was wonderful. It was really fabulous. Yes. Yeah. Come over here.
Go, Matthew, go.
Do you need the microphone? Do you think I can hear you?
You meet Professor Barley every now and then. He usually sits there at
Yeah.
the open area and he's more than willing to talk to people
Yeah.
about Genadendal. But
Because-
mine is only until 1836. From there, I can't
Can't go back
go
further.
back further. It's a lot of slave and somehow the Wessels family.
Yeah.
They say they sort of settled in the Caledon area.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
even they say that that my ancestors aren't really descended from the Wessels. They say that the Wessels had left earlier.
Yeah,
So, but for some reason, she kept the Wessels surname.
yeah.
And then my line starts from there. But
It's
but-
quite interesting that you're saying vessels because I'm starting my second book and my third book, right? And also Skinner stories. And there was, these rebel Boers who were in Slagter's Neck Rebellion, and they were really a wild bunch. And they sometimes married their first wife, but then they just had mistresses after that. And this one, her name was Dorothea Wessels, and she was of coloured blood. She had a white father, I think a coloured mother, and it was Wessels. So that's interesting. And that was on the eastern frontier, up near Slagter's Neck.
But, June, I showed both Matthew and Zuleika the Church of the Latter-day Saints
Oh,
website.
yes, yes.
Because there you can actually see transcripts of the baptisms, because that was where all the baptisms were recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
So they can click straight through to the image of both of these two. Fascinating.
Can I just make a pick up on that? I try to raise my voice. I have to
Yes, good.
The church records are particularly good for people of colour. That is so. But before about 1833, as you say, there's not much.
Yeah.
But in the Lutheran Church in Strand Street, their first
Yes,
baptisms
it was a
took
slave
place-
church.
Their
Yeah.
first baptisms took place in 1780.
Yeah.
You won't get anything earlier than that. But in the Groote Kerk, look, there was the only church that was allowed was the Dutch Reformed Church, and then from 1780 you could also baptize and then worship in the Lutheran Church. So anybody who married anybody of colour, or there was anything, or you were Roman Catholic or Jewish, anything like that, you could then use that church, the Lutheran Church. The problem is this: that those records were available in the Cape Archives till about 3 years ago. And the congregation of the Lutheran Church, now you must remember there are various Lutheran churches who aren't exactly the same faith in Cape Town. The one in St. Martini, for instance, is
Yeah.
not the same Lutheran church as the one in Strand Street.
And there's one in the Martin Milk House.
That's the one I'm
Yeah.
talking about.
They've got a lot of records there.
They've taken their records back.
Yeah.
And those records are not accessible and not available.
Yeah.
They've not been digitized either. Now, it is such a pity. It is a religious issue. They don't want their records to be public. In fact, it's very much about the Latter-day Saints.
Because rebaptizing your ancestors.
They rebaptized ancestors, and the Lutheran Church said, no ways do we want our ancestors to be rebaptized by whoever. But if one day they will become available, they want to digitize them, but obviously it costs money and so on. So maybe the next generation of congregation will have a different view on it. But the Muslim records are impossible because there are no gravestones really. There's no record of births and marriages. It's almost impossible. So then you have to go by word of mouth, which amazingly is often very accurate. Not 100%, but for instance, for the Jonker family, there was always this discussion on whether Adolf Jonker was of white descent or what his issue was. And there was a fantastically well-researched article published by, I think, Jaco Strauss and M.C. Lowe on going back to his roots, that both his parents came from Indonesia. And I'm not talking about 1800s, I'm talking about 1600s. So now and then you get these gems where people through the slave records are able to decipher these things and try and translate. How would the Dutch at the time have translated those names into Dutch-sounding names? So
Yes.
but this takes dedication of enormous proportions. But it can be done.
This is where it's worthwhile to join genealogical societies, because in my society, we're part of the one of South Africa, but I say we meet in Pinans, and we've got members who have gone over to Salt Lake City, who've gone to The Hague, have gone to places in Germany, and they have looked at original, and we publish quarterly the Capensis, which is it's only for members, and they write on these, roots going back. And then, of course, we get Familiar, which is the Genealogical Society of South Africa that comes from Pretoria. And there are also people who've gone overseas and looked at records there. And the Family History Society in Wynberg, a lot of their members have gone back to England. There are some fascinating talks where they show you the Crusaders lying like this in the church, that, they've gone back to family records.
I'm going to make another comment if I may. I don't think people understand how primitive the original settlers were here. You spoke about they were like the ragtag kind of
They were,
from Europe.
yeah.
And they really were. They ate communally out of a single bowl, 6 to 8 men per bowl. And those were the only utensils they had. They may have had a spoon, and they probably shared a spoon. That was it.
And
There
if,
were a few people who could write, like Van Riebeeck and Van der Stel and so forth. But so a big change in South Africa, and the colonists came when the French Huguenots arrived.
but even the French Huguenots were very poor. So only de Villiers brothers were quite wealthy, and they built because they had to make their own farmhouses, till their own land.
But they were landowners before.
Yeah.
They could read and write. And it was a huge change that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, the strange thing though is that within 2 generations, most of the French lost their language.
Yeah, well, that was Simon van der Stel. He made that. That was part of his law. He actually put Dutch and German settlers. If you were French Huguenot, then he put Vanilla there because she's Irish, and he put her in the next one because she's German. And then you only got a French Huguenot. Just try and separate you. And he didn't want them to have.
People in my ancestry, not just with my surnames. Is there another comment, question here?
I just like to ask, my records are fairly complete as far as my South African families are concerned.
Which are?
De Villiers and Cloete.
Oh, I'm related to you on my Adrian's side of my farm, my mother's grandmother's side.
But my question now is, how do I jump the ocean and get back? For instance, take the De Villiers. They're always shown as coming from La Rochelle. Now, I'm descended from all 3 brothers.
Yes.
I don't believe they came from La Rochelle at all. La Rochelle was where they were walled up by the French government for such a long time was when La Rochelle fell, that the Huguenots had to leave the city and flee. I think there must be another story.
There is a book I know it's in the Belleville Library. It's probably in other libraries. I can't think what it's called. Is it Maurice Boucher?
That's the one.
I'm not quite sure. And he talks about it gives you where they come from. It's fascinating. Like the Jabez who walked barefoot up to get to Holland, and they had nothing left, and they had no shoes left, and things like that. And he even gives you some of the de Villiers, the letters that the brothers wrote to their parents, or their parents wrote to them. It's very interesting. It's quite a thin little book, but it's very intense. Belleville Library's got it, but to go on to Cape Town, a brocade, brocade, like a material, brocade, Cape Town Library Services. Then once you get into that, go into Quick Survey, and then you type in Maurice Boucher, and then you'll find, and they give you all the districts. I always just put all districts, and then you'll find which library it's in. But it's definitely in the Belleville Library.
And then somebody like Jan Cloete, who came here with Van Riebeck, presumably as a mercenary.
With, sorry?
With Van Riebeck. The first Cloete arrived here with Van Riebeck. He was on the ship. And he's designated as a soldier. Now, it's always been said that his name was actually Cloete.
Cloete, yeah, Kluten. Yeah.
Cloete from Germany, from near Cologne. Now, presumably the Dutch East India Company came around.
Yeah. Well, that, again, my genealogical society, in one of his, either the Capensis or the Familiar, I think it's the Capensis, about 2-3 years ago, somebody went right back to his background and how he went backwards and forwards with his children, where he came from and who his parents were, and the birth records.
I'd like to try and get hold of that.
You can't, what?
If you want to take down my email, I'll have a look and see which copy it was.
For the branch or for the book?
You can see Maurice Boucher.
I was just.
Yeah.
Behind you, right behind you.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Which one is he?
Maurice Boucher.
Oh, this one.
Maurice
this one.
Boucher. Maurice Boucher. I haven't got my glasses on.
I know. I'm also not,
Go into
I'm also
a
not
quick,
stagger
quick
around.
quick search. I don't know which area he stays in, because mine's always area 5, it's behind the Boerewors curtain.
Available in the following libraries.
Yeah.
I can just reserve it for you.
Belleville, Central Library, Durbanville, Somerset West, Wynberg.
Well, that's close to me.
Yeah. You want me to give you the shelf number?
One.
I just want,
That clues.
If you want to take my email, you can, and then I'll have a look to see, scratch through my copies and see which one it is. It's June, like the month of June. mck@mweb.co.za.
So, this is the site we went to with Matthew. Is that how you spell your name? And then, so this is the family
That's
search.
interesting.
And because South Africa's got all this, so many people who've recorded births and that.
Yes, that's a wonderful site, that family search.
I don't know. Was any of these one that you recognise? No, you couldn't remember a first name, could you? Okay. Anyway, that's a site. Are there any other questions or comments?
Let me make another comment. Since there was this discussion on people of colour, if you, in the Afrikaans Afrikaans families, until about 1860, I think the Afrikaans people and the English people in South Africa stayed completely apart. And even past the Boer War, there was very little mixing between English-speaking people and Afrikaans-speaking people in the country. So the Afrikaans people, if I can call it like that, as a group, were quite contained in a certain way. If you trace back the family trees of Afrikaans people, and you can mention any name, any surname, and they would have most likely either in the as the progenitor or as the first generation a person of color, and not always women, but if it's women, it's largely slaves from the Indian subcontinent. Largely. Strange thing. Very few Khoi people in the Afrikaans people, but almost, I would say.
But that was the governors at the time. There were about 20 to 30 European men to one European woman at the Cape. And they said, start marrying your, they called them Malay slaves, but they were mostly from the Bay of Bengal. They were Indians. Marry them, and we will help you, but you had to pay. You had to pay a bride, and quite often if the husband died and the price wasn't paid off, that poor woman as a widow had to keep paying for her price for having married that man. But this is what they said, you must just start marrying them.
But also, why this distinct, how should I say, I would say preference, but distinctly so that it's the slave girls, and I think it's because they had skills. They were seamstresses, they could cook, they could do things, whereas the local people, the indigenous people, didn't have the skills. And so it was this closer to the home, as it were. I think it was difficult, but if you look at the records, it's not
because the Khoi people didn't want to be labourers. They wanted to keep their clan lives. And just a few of them started working cities, but of course the smallpox did that. There's terrible smallpox epidemics where their clans disintegrated and they were so ill. So then they'd start working as servants for the farmers and filter into the towns and villages. Whereas the Indian slave women and most of the Indian slave men, they were the people who were the carpenters, and they could make coaches and carve furniture, and the women, as you say, were cooks and nannies, and they could sew, and they worked in your house. The black slaves, you worked in your garden and on your farmlands. They're the people who did the heavy labour, even the women. It was terrible. They had babies on their backs and they had to give birth in the fields and things like that. Whereas your Indian slave women, Malay slaves and Khoi servants were sort of more prized, and you looked after them better.
Wasn't there also the fact that there was a great interaction between Batavia and the Cape?
Yes,
and
yes.
the Dutch way of living in Batavia. There was a lot of cohabitation and marriage, cross-marriage, and between the Indian and Indonesian people and the Dutch at the time. And so there was nothing unusual about it. I mean, that came much later.
Yeah.
I definitely get the sense from history that racism grew rather than it's. I mean, we sometimes have this notion that they were so racist. I don't think they were half as racist as we
We have a very interesting case which has come up fairly recently in our family where Hendricks Cloete bought Groote Kerk.
Yes, we used to speak to you. We were the fun debaters.
Yeah, you speak to us, yes. And the only woman to have owned Groote Kerk was Anna de Koenen. Now, Anna was the daughter of Angela Bengal.
That's right, I married Besson. Yeah.
My eldest son has recently married Alessandra Mayer, and she is a descendant of those two. So my eldest grandson from that particular son is a descendant of Anna de Koenen, as well as from Hendrik of Constantia. So
Yeah.
we now have a very interesting
And if you listen to Cape Talk radio, Dion Bing, he does was in Cape Town, a Soof report. And his mom, Mel Bing, she showed me the one day beautiful ceramic dishes with van Rede tot Oudtshoorn. It was a wedding present to a great-great-grandmother. And she said, June, will you do my family tree? And she's descended from Anna de Koenen through her mother's line, and this is where the dishes came from. And if you look at that photo of Anna, that was Mel. She was this tiny, beautiful, petite little person.
It is now 7 o'clock. Thank you all so much for coming. June has copies of her book at 150 Rand each, which...
In the shops at 200 Rand.